morning. Today we'll be reading from James chapter 3 verse 5. James chapter 3 verse 5. So too, though the tongue is a small part of the body, it boasts great things. Consider how a small fire sets ablaze a large forest.
Thank you, Jaden, and good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday morning worship service. We are excited for you to be here, and you're always welcome to come and to study with us and have fun discussions like what we had this morning with the Holy Spirit. It can get deep sometimes, but that's what we want to do, because the deeper we can get into the Scripture, the better knowledge we have of God and the better relationships that we can have with Him through our study and whatnot and our discussion. In James chapter 3 and verse 5, we find that the tongue has a lot of power. Even though it's, as the King James Version says, a small member or a small part of our body, it does boast great things. We can save the world or destroy the world with a microphone. If we can say the right things in the right way, we can influence a lot of people. The power of, what good would a salesman be if he wasn't able to talk you into buying whatever it is he's trying to sell you, right? If a salesman can't speak well, he's not going to be able to sell well. And the same is true with us in our everyday life. There's some people we know just the right words to say to manipulate them, and we can either choose to use that or choose to be honest and not try to manipulate everybody. You see what I mean? We have this power in our speech. We have power to cut people down by spreading gossip, by spreading rumors, by hurting people, and we have the power to save the world through preaching the gospel to those who we meet. Our tongue is a very powerful thing, and it's a temptation to use it for evil and to use it for good. In the history of Israel, God always chose the humble individual to bring about His will. I said always, in most cases. For example, the greatest leader that Israel ever had was a man that came from herding sheep. The least of his brothers, the one who didn't participate in the army, he had no idea he was going to be king of Israel one day, and yet God chose him, the meek and lowly David, to be the greatest king that ever was in Israel's history, to be called the friend of God. The leader of Israel, to begin with, was someone who thought that he couldn't speak well, thought that he couldn't lead well, thought that just about anybody else would have been better for the job than him, and his name was Moses. And yet it was him to whom God spoke from the bush, saying, "I am, and go and let my people free." So God chooses people that we might not always suspect to be the ones that He chooses, to rule over His people, to lead His people, to bring a change to the world. Who would have chosen Saul of Tarsus, who spent every single day breathing out threatenings and whatnot against the church and wanting to put him to death? Who would have chosen him to be one of the most well-known, influential gospel preachers of the first century, who preached the gospel to literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people in every city across Asia Minor, and Europe? God chooses people who we don't suspect to have a big impact. The point of that is, don't think that you can't have an influence on those around you. Don't think that your influence is too small. Don't think that you don't know enough. Don't think that you are not good enough of a speaker, that you're not good enough of a leader to have an impact on your community. Every single person here can have a positive impact or a negative impact on those around them. How many of us have woken up in the day, looked ourselves in the mirror, and said like Moses, "Why me? Why am I doing this job?" I know there's times in especially in this work, but also in secular work, where you just go, "Who in the world would sign me up to do this? I'm not worthy to do this at all. I can't sell a cell phone." That's what I thought a lot of times. Why would somebody pick me to do this job? That's ridiculous. I sure got them fooled. And sometimes when I'm putting on my church clothes, that's what I think as well. I look at myself in the mirror as I shave, and I'm thinking, man, these people, they've just hired the most low-down, crazy person to teach them that they've ever chosen. And here I am. And that's how you feel sometimes about yourself, right? And yet God can use you. Just because you have a low opinion of yourself doesn't mean that God does. God can use anybody to accomplish his will. But the point is that we have to allow him. We have to be willing to take that leap of faith and use the gifts that God has given us to accomplish greatness in the world. Go in your Bible to the book of Luke, chapter 4. Luke, chapter 4. We're going to talk about two individuals today who had a great impact on those around them. And it came from the most unsuspecting place. Luke chapter 4 and verse 27. Now really think about this passage as we read it. Luke 4:27. There were many lepers in Israel. Not leopards, but lepers. There are many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. None of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. Notice the response to this. And all the people in the synagogue were filled with rage as they heard these things. They got up and drove him out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill on which their city had been built in order to throw him down the cliff. At what he said there. There were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. Let's go back to that account and see why it was that Naaman was cleansed. What led Naaman to be the only leper to be cleansed of his leprosy in all of Israel? 2 Kings chapter 5, if you would. 2 Kings chapter 5. Let's begin here in verse 1. In 2 Kings chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, we read, Now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master. 2 Kings 5 and verse 1. He was highly respected, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, then he would cure him of his leprosy. Now, how did she know that? No person, there were tons of lepers in Israel, and no person up to this point had been cleansed by Elisha of their leprosy. How did she know? She had faith. She had heard stories from her mom and dad about what God had done in the land of Egypt. Probably what he did with Moses' hand, right? When he put his hand into his clothing and pulled it out, it had leprosy, and he put it back in and pulled it out and it was cleansed. She probably heard stories about them crossing the Red Sea, about people being risen from the dead by prophets, and all these other wonderful things. And so she's able to determine, this little girl who is taken into captivity, you think the last thing she'd want to do is help out her master, right? But she says, I think that if you go to that prophet in Samaria, that he'll be, not just I think, right? But I know. She said, I wish that you were with him because he would cure him of his leprosy. Look at the risk that's involved in that. If you make the captain of this army to go all the way to Samaria to be cleansed of his leprosy, and it's just a joke, it's just fake, it doesn't actually happen, then what's that going to do to you? You might lose your job or lose your servitude, right? You might be sold into a lesser house or something like that. You might even lose your life for wasting the captain of the army's time like that. Hey, and look at that. The TV broke. But the point is, the faith of this little girl is probably greater than what a lot of people have. Maybe what even we have. The fact that she was able to not only trust in the power of God, but being willing to take that risk to send her master out to be cleansed by this prophet who she'd never heard of cleansing anybody. Remember, no other leper was cleansed in all of Israel until Naaman, and he was cleansed because this little girl took that opportunity to tell her mistress about the power of God. Now think about this. when you think about ancient times, and even in today's times as well, and you think about the two genders, male and female, you have one is typically associated with being the stronger sex, right? Typically has a better place in society in ancient times. They would able to be the ones that would own the land and whatnot. Now, regardless of whether or not that's right or correct, or we agree with those ideas, that's how it was. So not only is this a female, but it's a little girl, not a woman who's made a name for herself as a prophetess or whatever, but this is a little girl. And not only is this a little girl, but this is a little girl in captivity. And it's this type of person that can have an influence on others to bring them to faith in God. Don't think that you don't have any influence. Don't think that you don't have any power. Don't think that God can't use you because of your lack of knowledge, or because of your lack of faith, or because of sins in your life or whatnot. God can use anybody. If he can use a little girl in captivity to a Gentile army, then he can use you as well to bring about his will. If you read on down in 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 4, Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus spoke the girl who is from the land of Israel." Then the king of Aram said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 changes of clothes. You know, that's kind of a funny list, right? Because you think, 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold. And we would think to ourselves, well, man, you could probably afford more than just 10 changes of clothes, right? But anyways, he goes down in verse 6, and he brings the letter to the king of Israel, saying, "And now, as this letter comes to you, behold, I've sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy." So they think it's going to be this king that's going to cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But now consider now and see how he's seeking a quarrel against me." And so this king is just upset because he can't even fathom the idea that somebody can be cleansed of their leprosy. Is he God? Is he able to do these things? I mean, after all, nobody in Israel had had their leprosy cleansed up to this point that he was aware of. This little girl who was in servitude to Naaman's wife had more faith than the king of Israel. He's the one that's supposed to have the faith. He's supposed to be the representative of God on earth to the people, following the law and being an example to everyone else. And he can't even fathom the idea that God could cleanse leprosy. Was he even aware of the story of Moses? Did he even know what happened at the Red Sea? How did he not trust in God to be able to accomplish this? But God be thanked, in verse 8 and following, we're not going to get into this, but that Elisha learns of this, and he's able to cleanse Naaman of his leprosy. It didn't take the king to get this accomplished, the person in power, the person in authority. It took the little people, the people that are most of the time looked over, the people that nobody really thinks twice about. It's those kind of people that can make a difference. And I know all of us, at least to some extent, feel like that at some point in our lives. But we can make a difference. We can make a change. Even if you don't have as much confidence in yourself. God, as my friend Dallas always says to me on the phone, he says, "I pray that God will use you in a mighty way." Well, God can use us in mighty ways if we put our faith in him. Now, that is true for good, but unfortunately, it's also true for evil. If we aren't careful, we can have an influence negatively. Oftentimes, when we fail to see what influence we can have for the good, we let ourselves slack and end up having an influence towards others in a negative way, in a negative light. Our bad attitude or our pessimism might rub off on others if we leave it unchecked. Go in your Bible to the book of Mark chapter 6, and let's see how this happens. Mark chapter 6. Now, I just learned about this chapter recently. I had never known this fact that I'm going to share with you up until now. Or not now, but, in my recent readings. Look at Mark chapter 6 and verse 14. Mark chapter 6 and verse verse 17. This is talking about the death of John the Baptist. For Herod himself had sent and had John arrested and bound in prison on account of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip, because he had married her. For he had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death and could not do so, for Herod was afraid of John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. And when he heard him, he was very perplexed, but he used to enjoy listening to him. Now, notice what's happened here. John the Baptist has been imprisoned, but he's not been imprisoned because Herod wants him to be in prison. He's put in prison because Herod is trying to save him from Herodias, who's trying to put him to death because he's making her feel bad because John keeps preaching, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." There's a lot that goes into this culturally between the feud between Herod and his brother, but this is a situation that we have. So now in verse 21 we read this. A strategic day came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his lords and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. And when the daughter of Herodias herself came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." And he swore to her, "Whatever you ask of me, I will give it to you, up to half my kingdom." Now, when we picture verse 22, I know what we all think. We all think of a girl probably in her, late teens, early 20s, maybe something like that, going in and dancing before all these men, and all these men get all excited, and they just want to give her everything, is what we typically think. But this is not what the text is talking about. This is not the picture that Mark's readers would have gotten from this passage. Let me explain. First off, the word girl here in verse 22 is not the word used for young, or is not the word used for like a young adult woman. Let me show you. The word girl here is used, it literally means, I don't know if you can see that or not. Well, that's not going to help you see anything, is it? It's mainly used, a little girl, a maiden, a damsel, a maid. Let me show you this in other parts of the book of Mark. I don't know how well you can see this, but other parts in the book of Mark, it's used like this. It's translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Mark 5:41. That one word is translated little girl. In Mark chapter 9 and verse 24, talking about this man's daughter, he says, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And then it's used elsewhere in the book of Matthew as well, basically in the same contexts. This is not a young, developed female dancing before men and trying to seduce them. This is a group of individuals, and that's the picture that we usually get. This is a little girl. She's the princess, and she's dancing, and Daddy wants to give her a big prize for that. This is not a lustful thing that's happening here in Mark chapter 6 and verse 22. In fact, the word pleased Herod is not in that negative connotation, but it's just an exciting emotion. He's just happy for her. For example, in Acts chapter 6 and verse 5, the statement found approval, there's that word, with the whole congregation. Did that whenever they talked about these widows in Acts chapter 6 and how they're going to get them help by appointing some deacons, that didn't make the disciples, pleased in the sense that we usually think of it, but they found approval of it. They approved of it. They were proud of that decision. Romans 8:8, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. All right? Let's see. 1 Corinthians chapter 7:32. But I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. This word please is not a negative connotation. This is a little girl dancing for her daddy, and he wants to give her a prize, give her a present, give her a gift, show her his love. This is a group of people being excited to see the princess, the future of the kingdom. And we usually read this passage in a negative connotation. Now, let's talk about something else about this. He says to her, "Ask me for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." If she's a younger girl, she might not know, a little girl, like we're thinking, she might not know what to ask for herself. But notice what happens. She went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask for?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." Immediately, she came in a hurry to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Now notice verse 25. Notice these words. Immediately, hurry, and then at once. She is really trying to do what her mother's told her. She wants to get it done right away. This isn't an idea that she's had on her own. This is something that her mother's told her to do, and she's responding to her mother's command. She's trying to go get it done for her mom as fast as possible. This is a little girl following mother's orders. This isn't a older girl, maybe late teens, early 20s, like we usually think of, that is in on the plot. This is a little girl who's following an influence and trying to do what her mother wants her to do. And then we see in verse 26, "And although the king was very sorry, yet because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests, he was unwilling to refuse her." Again, unwilling to refuse her. This is not a lascivious thing. This is a daddy trying to give his daughter something, and this is what her daughter's asked for, this impossible task. And so immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded him to bring back his head. And he went and had him beheaded in the prison, and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about this, they came and took away his body and laid it in a tomb. This whole series of events that we have here in Mark chapter 6, verse 17 and following, the particulars of the events are speculative. Okay, we might be able to have debates about the exact nature of all the dancing and all that kind of stuff. But here's the point that I was going to make. This little girl here in Mark chapter 6, she has a great influence over King Herod, the most powerful man in the area at this time, right below Caesar. And she's able to influence him to commit this awful atrocity of killing John the Baptist. Little girl, big influence. None of us are below having an influence on our community. You say, "I'm not equipped to teach the gospel. I'm not equipped to share Christ with my neighbor. I'm not equipped to invite people to Bible class, to invite people to worship." Well, if a little girl can have enough faith to get somebody from the top of the army to go and be cleansed of leprosy that she's never even seen done before, then surely you can invite somebody to Bible class. If somebody like this little girl can have such influence over King Herod, then certainly you can have influence over your neighbor or over your relative whom you've known for years and years and years. Or maybe somebody that you don't even know. We have more influence than we think we have. And we're really limited in our influence by our own preconceived ideas about ourselves. We have infinite potential, but we just limit ourselves, in other words. We can make an impact on the community, just like these two little girls made such a big impact. And again, we're only limited by what we think. As Jaden read for us a while ago in James chapter 3, the tongue can start a fire. Now it can start a fire for evil through gossip and things like that, stuff that we, that human beings typically like to do, or it can start a fire for good by getting people excited about Christ, by living in such a way to not where you have to go out and preach to everybody, but where they come and asking for you to preach to them because they want to know how you got to where you are. They want to know why you're as happy and as at peace and have the joy that you have. Again, here's another thing. Why do you think Naaman trusted that random little girl from Israel? Maybe it's because he saw that the faith that she had was genuine, that she knew that she wasn't just sending him on a wild goose chase, but he saw something in her that showed that she was being legitimate, that showed that she was being real in her faith. And people can see that in you. If you invite people to church out of necessity because you think you have to, and not because you want to share with them the love of God that you've experienced in your life, then people can see the difference in that. So we got to, keep these things in mind. Okay, main point of the lesson, influence. You've got it more than you think you do. You've got it more than you think you do. Don't limit yourself because of lies that you tell yourself when you look at yourself in the mirror. All right? We've all been there. At least I've been there for sure. And oftentimes we're our own worst critic, whereas everybody else, including God, is rooting for us and cheering for us. Put your talents to use. They're given to you by God, and you can make a difference in this community. That might not mean making the church blow up into, hundreds and hundreds of people, but it may mean showing your neighbor who's on their deathbed that you truly love them and somebody in this world does care about them, and that can make all the difference. There's more that you can do than you give yourself credit for, so put your talents to use. All right. That being said, we offer a